Most philosophy since the ancient Greeks has been conducted using sequential linear analysis. This is what allows us to have a sense of certainty about things, since either the conclusion follows from the premises or it doesn't. The essence of rationality is creating rules which we hold to be true, and then using these rules to draw conclusions. For example, we can define a mammal as a warm-blooded vertebrate with hair or fur and the secretion of milk in females. This criteria can then be used to check whether a thing is a mammal or not. This is how the left hemisphere thinks. It creates closed loops by which things can be distinguished from other things, and this is how it is able to divide the world into distinct entities. This produces a sense that we can draw definite conclusions about the world with no ambiguity. A thing is either a mammal or it is not. Rationality is carried out by the left hemisphere, and it entails creating an enclosed system by which facts can be determined. Math is exactly like this. We start out with basic axioms, such as the fact that a plus b equals b plus a, and then use these axioms to find true statements that follow assuming the axioms are true. This has been a useful way of approaching knowledge, but rationality has certain limitations. For instance, any time you create a closed system, there is no guarantee that the axioms are true. You just assume that they are and hope that they are consistent. For example, how many continents are there? The standard answer is 7, and yet depending on how you define the word continent, there may be as few as 4 continents. The word continent is just something we define, and yet by having a strict, standard definition of continent, we make it seem like a very complex question actually has a fairly simple, straightforward, and unambiguous answer, which is what the left hemisphere prefers. But in reality, the world is extremely ambiguous, and there is no correct way to count the number of continents. But our left hemispheres hate the fact that this question doesn't have a certain answer, and will often vehemently insist that there are a definite number of continents. The right hemisphere is able to deal with the lack of certainty, and knows that the world can't be neatly divided and categorized. In fact, it is our right hemispheres which can acknowledge different points of view simultaneously, while acknowledging that each may illuminate different aspects of the true picture. If we define continent in one way, we learn something about the world. Defining it in a different way, a different picture emerges, which gives us different information. The left hemisphere is obsessed with absolute rules, since this is what produces a sense of certainty. But the real world is often filled with things which disobey the rules which we impose upon them. In other words, the left hemisphere creates closed systems wherein it can form deductions, while the right hemisphere transcends these systems. Here we can see a fundamental difference between the cognitive styles of the left and right hemisphere. The left hemisphere deals with rationality, with rules within a self-enclosed system, and makes deductions by confining itself within this system and following the logic to its conclusions. The right hemisphere deals with transcendence, i.e., going beyond our assumptions to arrive at higher insights, which take into account the inherent ambiguity of the world, which is why it is more impressed by art, which resists logical analysis. In the history of philosophy, we can observe the clash between the right and left hemisphere, particularly in various paradoxes which arose in Greek philosophy. The ship of Theseus is one such paradox. If you replaced one plank of wood from the ship with a new one, is the ship the same or not? You would probably say that the ship is the same. But what if you gradually replace every plank of wood in the ship with a new one? At what point is the ship no longer the original ship, but a brand new ship? The reason this seems like a paradox is because the left hemisphere views the ship as either the same or not the same. It prefers clearly identifiable entities, which is why this seems like a paradox. The right hemisphere, however, can acknowledge that the ship is somewhat different and somewhat the same. In other words, it can seemingly hold contradictory notions at once, and this is actually more accurate to the true nature of the ship. Another paradox is the Epimenides Paradox. Epimenides was a Cretan philosopher who declared that all Cretans are liars. But if that statement is true, it means Epimenides is a liar, which means the statement is false. But if it is false, it must be true. This is a paradox of self-reference, and it shows the flaw in the left hemisphere's way of thinking. It essentially creates a closed, rigid system, and truth must be determined within this system, i.e., the rules are taken to be literal and absolute, which produces the paradox. But in the real world, we know that rules like this aren't that rigid, and Epimenides probably wasn't being literal when he said that all Cretans are liars. The left hemisphere has a hard time handling ambiguity, since it deals with true or not true, which is why it has difficulty with metaphorical meanings. Western philosophy has pretty much proceeded via the route of the left hemisphere, using language and fixed rules, bound within enclosed systems, to make things explicit and unambiguous. However, does this capture the actual nature of reality? To an extent, by relying so heavily on the left hemisphere, philosophy has been a pursuit of certainty, But the problem with this pursuit became clear during the rise of phenomenology in the 20th century, which undermined the seemingly secure foundations of philosophy up to that point. The phenomenologists were able to rediscover the right hemisphere's mode of cognition. Phenomenology is a field of inquiry, which attempts to study the mind from the inside, to actually view your own cognitive processes in real time. This was necessary because rationalism has led us to think that we can understand the world objectively. But this is not as obvious as it seems. For one thing, we are always viewing the world with our minds, and our minds are always involved in the process of knowing. Therefore, it is impossible to know the world apart from our minds, and since each of us have different experiences, we all experience the world differently. Some of us might view homeless people as lazy, while others view them as misfortunate. This doesn't mean that there is no objective reality, but rather, it means that we need to be aware of the role of subjectivity in construing the objective world. The tendency towards abstraction in rationalism fails to account for the context of any given situation, in that to understand a homeless man's predicament, we need to understand his particular situation, rather than imposing generalized rules. Take this question, for instance. Was the British Empire good or evil? It is easy to take a side, either good or evil, and then find evidence which supports this view. The left hemisphere feels like this is an objective question. The answer is either good or evil. But the right hemisphere understands the true complexity of such a question, and there isn't an objective answer. It also understands that one can come to a deeper understanding of this topic by taking various perspectives. If you assume that it was evil, this will illuminate certain aspects of the British Empire. If you assume that it was good, this will illuminate others. We come to a more complete picture of the subject by taking different perspectives and integrating what we learn into a cohesive whole, one which incorporates it into a broader context, the whole of which is understood unconsciously. Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, and in many ways, the school of phenomenology arose in response to the way rationalism had gripped philosophy up to that point. Husserl believed that understanding had been gripped by verblinden Rationalismus, mad rationalism, and Blindheit für das Transzendentale, blindness for the transcendental. Husserl realized that consciousness is always imposing a particular model on the world, and then using this model to derive information about the world. But the model itself determines what we find. If we treat the brain like a computer, we will begin to think of the brain as a computer. If we assume that the British Empire was good, this is what we will find. Instead, we need to consider various perspectives, through which a whole picture can emerge. It is like using consciousness to scan an object with varying frequencies of light, and this allows a deeper understanding of the object to emerge in the unconscious. Each frequency can be thought of as a different perspective, and by using different perspectives, a picture of the entire object emerges. Husserl also developed the idea of intersubjectivity. We live in an intersubjective world. There is an objective world out there, but it is colored with our subjective minds. Intersubjectivity also implies that we each have individual perspectives, and that different aspects of the world emerge from these perspectives. Our world is a mix of objectivity and subjectivity, not one or the other, whereas rationalism believes it to be more or less objective. The French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty pointed out that communication with others depends on empathy, because you need to feel what they are feeling in order to understand what they are saying. When you listen to someone speak, it is like you create a version of themselves inside your mind, and it is only through empathy that you can understand what they mean. Therefore, there is a sense in which we can't merely use rationalism to understand the world, but we must also use our emotions, which characterizes the difference between the left and right hemispheres. Arguably the most famous phenomenologist was Martin Heidegger, and he believed that we all perceive the world differently, based on our own experiences. We each interpret the world differently, but this doesn't mean that everything is subjective or that there is no truth. If we believe the British Empire to be good, there is a sense in which this is true, but there is also a sense in which the opposite is true. This seeming contradiction is unacceptable to the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere, since it can hold various perspectives at once, understands how this is possible. The left hemisphere regards there as being only one truth, whereas the right hemisphere can understand the multifaceted nature of this, and thereby understand the object in a much more complex manner. Heidegger equated truth with aletheia, which means unconcealing, which fundamentally means that the world exists in a state of concealment, and we need to unconceal it for it to make sense to us. But any act of unconcealment necessarily conceals something else. We can unconceal something like the color blue by studying electromagnetic waves and discovering that blue light is a certain frequency. But this conceals the subjective experience of blue, which brings forth something else, i.e. the actual experience of blue. Anytime we understand something, we conceal certain aspects of it. But by using this approach from multiple perspectives, we can deepen our understanding of something like the color blue. Because the left hemisphere operates on closed loops, anything which transcends this enclosed system is taken to be weird or is rejected because it doesn't obey the rules we have imposed upon it. In other words, our initial assumptions bias the way we think and make us unwilling to accept ideas which break these assumptions. But oftentimes, new scientific discoveries are not found by following the trail of logic, but rather by transcending it. This is why the left hemisphere tends to be repulsed by notions which contradict what it already knows, since it prefers to be bound within the system it develops. When it comes up with a rule, it tends to stick with this rule and is unable to transcend it. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, can go beyond the self-enclosed system we develop to uncover ideas which are not obvious. This is why creativity is a product of the right hemisphere, since creativity means going beyond what we think is obvious, i.e., the self-enclosed system of the left hemisphere. Whenever we want to modify our assumptions, we use our right hemispheres, and this is why the right hemisphere is transcendent.